Hello everyone, today we talk about what was to become the medieval Schleswig-Holstein in the first half of the first millennium AD for our historical regions series that we resume. We're looking at essentially a very specific part of the Jutland Peninsula, right, Northern Europe, that is in fact hosting modern-day Schleswig-Holstein, which practically constitutes its base. Schleswig is also called Seno-Jutland, that is Southern Jutland. And there is a general understanding, if you look at the Old Norse sagas, perhaps dating back to, in fact, the migration era, that the Angles and the Jutes were settled in a fashion as to make the Jutland essentially split into a northern and southern part that would border along the Kongel River. That basically would be the one between today's, in fact, so-called southern Jutland and southern Schleswig, the former in the north, the other in the south. Right. As we will see now, there are uncertainties regarding the actual, time and space of all these various political stabilizations. Right, there were movements, as we will see, chiefly from the north, with the Danes that pushed gradually towards the south. Also, given the departure of peoples like the Angles, the Jutes, but also the Saxons later on. So much so that even after Charlemagne had defeated the North Albanians, the Danes, yes, were digging in, right, with the Danevirke that actually was much older and dating, at least in its beginning, because it was reinforced later on. It was a famous system of fortifications that was gradually, in fact, reinforced over time in the southern border that we will define now, right? And that thus would bring the Danes in contrast anyway with what would become Germany, right? And we will see this in another video that goes beyond the year 1000, even though even today we can appreciate that contrast existing between those that lived and from one side and another, without mentioning, of course, there were even third, fourth parties involved that importantly modified the political geography of the place. Now, looking at both archaeology and classical sources, we could infer that the Jutes inhabited both the Kongel region and as well as the more northern part of the Jutland Peninsula, while the Angles lived somewhat around the towns of Aithabo. Curiously enough, Hedeby is important, would be in fact later Danish Viking Age trading settlement near, in fact, the southern end of the Jutland, and we will explain why it was so important. Basically, they could essentially ship from there through the rivers, like all this, massive traffics of the north from the Baltic to the North Sea without having actually to go around the entire Jutland, right? And there is, from 1985, a museum there for which they reconstructed some of the houses of the time and all this stuff. But it's also one of those settlements like Dorestad that basically rose and fell within the time span, in fact, of the Viking Age. Hedeby was destroyed in the very 1066, right? So a bit marking, as you know, also for what was happening in Britain, the end of the so-called Viking era, even though things didn't really change excessively, right? I just made a video about the Battle of Largs that illustrates that even for much later times. In any case, going back to the Angles, right? These did occupy Schleswig, and what would be the later Schleswig. In these movements of peoples, you have the Saxons that, as you know, also migrated in large numbers further west across the sea, but that also were expanding in this area between northern and central Europe. All right, and that we will see all now in depth in a while. The Saxon settlement would be particularly important for the later, as you know, contest for the control of this frontier that would historically remain so, and for which even Germany and Denmark would struggle much later in times. It would be interesting to descend also in some other details, but we can do this for at least a video on ancient times regarding, for example, the connection between the Reudingi Germans, the ones who worshipped Nerthus, the story of Tacitus, etc., and the Saxons, given that at least these were peoples who lived essentially in the same place. These Saxons originally occupied the area of Western Holstein, known historically as North Albingia, which means north of the Elbe River. It was one of the main provinces of Saxony. I made a video about the Duchy of Saxony. We didn't talk about the old Saxons as such. I will make a video about them at some point. But essentially these were the northernmost, some also of the wildest, and also less powerful among the various groups, especially compared to one in Central Europe proper. There were from the east, however, also arriving up to the Elbe in the west, Slavic peoples, including the Vagrants, that were part of the Oboldrite confederacy. We will also have to see that were in turn part of the Polabian Slavs. I made in the last months a couple of videos talking about the struggle between the Saxons and these Slavs, but say in Ottonian times, so in a different moment from the original settlement, and especially for the Saxons, say evolution into the royal and imperial power in the continent. That settled in Eastern Holstein as well. And the area, as you understand, it we will see better now, had a great strategic relevance as far as especially the Baltic, but in part also North Sea traffics indirectly really was concerned. It was a frontier area that would remain so also over time. Centers like Aithabu sort of predate also important, more permanent trade centers such as Lübeck, that was originally a Slavic settlement that went destroyed during the fight against the same Slavs and rebuilt by the Dukes of Saxony in the 12th century, would become essentially the capital, the mother city of the Hanseatic League. So that the region of this bitter contention would stem from essentially having at disposal such a strategic piece of land, but having it also decentralized from the major centers of power. Yes, Saxony was close to that at the point. Probably the German house, in fact, royal house, would rule from there. But as you know, those were involved pretty much all over Central Europe, in the Italian peninsula, and so this was not, in perspective, the single most important thing they had to check. But of course, the relations with Denmark were quite relevant, because this was also forming as essentially the most powerful of the Scandinavian monarchies that would remain essentially fragile throughout the entire Middle Ages. I made a video about all the main, say, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and we'll keep talking naturally also about these clashes here. I talked here and there of the relation between the Franks and the Danes in the videos about Louis the Pious, right? So we highlighted some aspects of this. We observed certain things also from the video about the Duchy of Saxony, etc. And the reason it's of also this difficulty in controlling these areas is not just that Northern Europe naturally took more to develop more robust political and institutional structures, but that the importance of this land stemmed greatly from essentially the traffic activity in the surrounding seas. So it was not really a place from which you could sediment a massive amount of power just per se. But in this, the Germans would mostly succeed on the long run. You know that, especially during the 14th century, the German mercenaries were swarming a bit all over Europe, and the more fragile Scandinavian monarchies were literally overrun sometimes by these, at times properly vassals of their crowns that were essentially German knights in filth. There came to run at some point even the individual Scandinavian realms de facto, and that's also an incredibly overlooked and important history that is often not told, but it does tell you, let's say, from which side, let's say, the bigger guns were overall. Even in Germany, where that especially in the north there wasn't much, especially actually from that time, much of a power concentration. Like after the decline of the Duchy of Saxony and the 14th century crisis, it would take a while before from both in northern Germany and in Scandinavia, politics would reinforce substantially. This is one of the reasons why the Hanseatic League was making so much money at the time, because it managed to escape this sort of centralistic control, right? And they could act a bit with this important naval power, for considering again the seaborne capacities, even of again countries that had always been at sea ever since they had been established as monarchies: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, etc. We will again talk about all these things. I'm approximating very much, but we need other videos to focus on that. In any case, you have, again, we can't say Saxons, Slavs, Danes, and even external folks that come every once in a while to raid, to cause other problems. And all these groups are somehow also subdivided among each other. The Danes essentially began to settle this area around the early Viking era. We're talking especially northern and central Schleswig, as well as the northern Frisians did. However, approximately after the 10th century and in western Schleswig, maintaining, by the way, some communities that would become famous in the Dithmarsch, for example, for later 14th century infantry victories that were due to the fact that the local nobility was not really that strong, and there were all these sort of labyrinth of these areas that were in part quite marshy, and so somehow defended, not by walls, but by literally nature, right, from the sea from one side and marshes from the other. We'll talk about the Danevirke, of course, a bit more, because that was an impressive infrastructural achievement, as you know, of the Danes, and that reflected a bit all these concerns of the struggle between North and South that were going on from actually the migration era. At least the earliest we can document the Danevirke, I think, is the second half of the 6th century, so not really the traditional date that of later times, right, during the Viking era, right? It existed also way before the Frankish threat, etc., and in the rivalries between these various peoples. And of course, considering that it was not like a fortifications alone have zero strategic value. They acquire it only when they are manned, and in the way they're manned, right? So this, think about Offa's Dyke. It's plenty of these fortifications all over Europe, also in more impressive ways, but these are somehow popularized because they were a big deal in the north, and they of course showed that there were important armies that could use these fortifications for also offensive capacities, not just defensive ones, right? But in any case, that highlights the relevance of this land. For the rest, we could say that throughout the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, more or less we see a certain continuity in the actual areas as far as the settlement was concerned, right? More or less the populated areas remain the same ones, the unpopulated ones the same. And so there is an important archaeological certification that allows us to document something. So lots of Angles began to migrate to the British Islands, right? The Danes took advantage of the movement, right? The Angles did move likely also, and not just Britain, of course. Some Danish islands were affected, at least by their passage. In any case, at this point, plausibly, we have an important part of immigration or occupation by the Danes of an important part of land left empty in the south. I say empty, but of course it was a gradual process of, say, integration. It was mostly based on the sense of who is in charge here, right? Who does command, right? And pretty much people remain. But do not underestimate, say, important changes. For example, Frisia, as you know, had undergone even terrible floods. Some areas had literally been, in that case, had been submerged, but the others had gone depopulated, and demographic concentration was not overwhelming in Northern Europe, so it is fair to say that some areas were also left, at least very sparsely populated, and this did favor, again, that Danish occupation. Skipping considerations about the differences between politically and military between the Danes and peoples like the Angles, the Utes, that were not radical. But as far as somebody moves in when somebody else has moved away, has to do with still the latter feeling a bit more confident in their achievements of even moving or restructuring their power somewhere else, even though the guys from the north definitely and historically from Scandinavia had pushed south, right, across Germany, towards Germany, at least in this case. We can't say that was surely yet another factor that could have prompted these movements. In fact, contacts increased between the Danes and the people on the northern half of the Jutish Peninsula as well, which tells you that the Danes were really expanding a bit on their own, and as you know, they would become the hegemonic power in the peninsula quite quickly. So, toponomastically speaking, we can conclude that the southern linguistic border of the Danish language seems to have been going from west to east up to the Trene River. That is particularly important because it basically runs. It flows from in the right bank of the Ida in the south, right? And instead runs in the North Sea. So this affluent fundamentally follows a north to south route, right? And so it's given that in the north of the Trene you have what is today's Flensburg, right? And so you have there the choking point of the peninsula, and so the Danes were coming from the north. Would immediately find it easier to occupy the western part on the North Sea of this land on the right bank of the Trene, right? And using that as a sort of initial line of settlement, of establishment, from which eventually to make the jump further east. And this would be, in fact, along the Danevirke, also known as the Danewerk, that again was this imposing system of fortifications that was enhanced over time and mostly was thought to have been in fact, implemented at the time of the Danish king Godfred. We are in the same times of the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, right? So, in a moment in which legitimately these peoples in the north were freaking out because the Frisians had been knocked out. The Carolingians had invaded also the full-scale Saxony, and with this incredibly relentless as effective ways, let's say, including massacres, deportations, etc. That, however, worked, right, and not to the destruction of Saxony. That, in fact, as we remembered, was the one that would actually take the place as the leading house of the empire after the Carolingians themselves. So you have, all these various layers of defense. This Danish language line arrived also cutting across from the Schlei estuary to Eckernförde, that, as we will see, is in fact the most strategic area, as we'll understand better, and leaving, however, the Schwanzen Peninsula across the sea free, right? There wasn't too much there. The most important centers, as we will see, were from the Danish side in this part. While the west coast of Schleswig had been, as we said before, an era of Frisian influence, language, right? So this composite picture is quite fascinating. From the east, instead, the Slavs arrived, so that the eastern area of modern Holstein was inhabited by, again, we said, the Vagrians, known as Vagri in Latin, a subgroup of the Obodride Confederacy, and of course causing problems because these neighbors didn't really have too many, sensitively, peaceful relations, right? Just by, just by mindset, and of course there was a great frequency also in the participation to joint expeditions, right? There were lots of Vikings that were actually later on of Slavic descent, notoriously, and from these very areas. And as you understand, also the ethnic differences were not radical, right? There were lots of similarities. If it hadn't been for language, you could not really see that was also, of course, influencing each other. Some of these groups would be taken out over time, so that we don't know much about them in the first place. But they had at least a pretty similar material culture, right? We can't say that definitely when the Franks conquered North Albingia, that became a bit the most advanced world. Saxony already was, right, just closer to civilization and tendentially more exposed to the influences coming from France especially, and imitating the earliest also there the Frankish costumes, because when you make war you really hybridize in many ways. And so this is true also for the Danes, that on the longer run, even if not conquered by the empire, were essentially the quickest imitators, culturally, religiously, materially, and becoming, in fact, for this reason, the more powerful of the Scandinavian powers. Now, apart from North Holstein and Schleswig, that were inhabited by the Danes, as we've seen, there was, again, North Albingia, Bagria, respectively in western and eastern Holstein, to make it simple. North Albingia, as we've seen, was one of the administrative regions of what would become, at least, the medieval Duchy of Saxony, roughly corresponding to the previous area of ethnic establishment of the Saxons. It was one of the four, again, together with Angria, Eastphalia, and Westphalia. North Albingia was also separated into different districts: Dithmarschen, Holstein, Stormarn, that is north of the Elbe, and the Adeln, south of the Elbe, on the left bank. A key event in the region is the Battle of Bornhoved in 798, fought between the Carolingian Empire and the Obotrite Confederacy against the Nordalbingian Saxons that brought to the defeat of the latter, right? With quite heavy losses that fundamentally opened to the Frankish establishment in the area, right? The field of battle was known as Sventanafeld or Sventanapolia, right? In Slavonic for sacred field. By the way, consider again this here that the Slavs were still pagan, but of course were supporting the Carolingians against the common Saxon enemy, and eventually they would become, in fact, the enemies of the same Eastern Franks. The battle takes the name from the fact that this place is located near the village of Bornhoved, near Neumünster, right? So the Frankish Count Bursius and the Slavic chieftain Droshko crushed the Nordalbingian Saxon resistance on this occasion. We are talking about large forces, apparently, right? From both sides, considering that the Saxon losses were in the thousands, right? These were not really the most dangers of the Saxons that had been already curbed, right? But the Frankish stepping into Nordalbingia meant obviously that the next frontier would have shifted with the to the one with the Danes. 10,000 Saxon families were allegedly deported to other areas of the Carolingian Empire after the Frankish victory, showing that, of course, the empire wanted to make this probably a militarized frontier of some sort. They didn't want to have, again, local resistance. These people were precious anyway, so they were relocated in some other areas where they could provide with labor force, manpower. Areas north of the Alps, such as Bagria, were essentially given to the Obotrites by the Franks, while Haveln, this strategic region between the Elbe and Weser estuaries, was directly incorporated by the empire. At that point, the Danes decided to strike the Obotrites, right? Because they realized that at least by knocking them out first, the Franks would have had much less operational capacity in the area. But the same Charlemagne intervened in favor of these pagan Slavic allies and pushed in the process the Danes out of the Ida River. So while Charlemagne was extending his realm at this point at the end of the 8th century, he also campaigned further north as he met a Danish army, essentially stemming from the combination of the various forces of the land, which managed to stop, in fact, his own imperial forces at the Danevirke. Right, this was really a formidable barrier across the south of the territory west of the Schlei, and it fulfilled its purpose. As a consequence, the Franks were to acknowledge that, at least temporarily, the boundary between their empire and the Danes would have been the Ida River in 811. Again, I've never talked about the Carolingian expansionistic aims in the Jutland Peninsula, but of course they were part of this broader cost-benefit rationale that obviously has to do with the broader political and strategic choices, especially of such large empires that were at this point tending to already overstretch in this case. And the Danes were ambiguous in many ways because they were essentially a rival force next to an area that had been just conquered by the Franks and that needed some time of stability. There was this, especially North Albingia, as we've seen, served a bit like a buffer area for Carolingian armies to operate. So definitely the Franks had the upper hand, but Denmark was somehow compacting, right, in a way that could keep even this major imperial armies out temporarily. Then there would be chances which the Carolingians did manage to break their forces even there, but there was never like an actual operation aimed at the destruction of the Danes in a broader sense, say the occupation of the Jutland at Similia. They were, however, essentially a unloyal client state of sort, and as we've seen, the Danish elite were tendentially compacting along patterns that they mutated from their Carolingian rivals as well. This area, as we were saying before, was not particularly developed at the time. However, it did have some local resources. Fishing, fairly good soil, especially for pasture, but also harvests. And in particular, there were tax and customs revenues, again, the most important element, from the market in Aithabo. That was becoming really a major trade centers for the Viking traffics. Arguably, it was actually the second largest center of the Viking era. So this tells you also how close the Viking activities were, just like on the same modern German land, for example. And it definitely was where, again, all the trade between the Baltic Sea and Western Europe passed, right? Because it was, as we will see now, a system of rivers inland, the inlet, etc., that allowed for this quicker passage than the circumnavigation of what was becoming Denmark. The Danevirke, by the way, was built immediately south of the road where boats or goods had to be hauled for approximately 5 kilometers as well, between a Baltic Sea bay and a small river, the Reiderau, known in Danish as the Reiderau. This fundamentally connected the Schlei Inlet, right, with the Trene River, and from there you could reach the Eider, and so the North Sea from the other side, right? So passing from the Baltic to the North Sea, right? And Aithabo was exactly on that axis, which makes you understand how and why it became so powerful. On the narrowest part of southern Jutland, in fact, this transit market protected by itself, even as a settlement, right, the Danevirke fortification, right. Rise Hedeby was located in the part of the inlet Schlei, essentially facing what is today the city of Schleswig, in fact, the northeastern part of Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, right? The capital of the Kreis being Flensburg. This made the area of modern-day Schleswig particularly wealthy at that point, where all the surplus accumulated in the raids, the traffics, mostly slaves, but also other items were, of course, allowing this center to gain importance in not just the broader Norse world, but also as essentially a bulwark in the south, so sustaining again the infrastructure of Danevirke had the Danes mobilized again against a Carolingian invasion, etc. Naturally, the Carolingian Empire collapsed at a point Yet, unfortunately for the Danes, this was, as we've seen, to revive exactly from the Duchy of Saxony, which naturally didn't have, say, first of all, the same power that the Carolingian Empire had had before, nor in the moment in which it became an imperial power was becoming so in the direction of the north that was less remunerative. Naturally, and we'll talk about this, there was a, let's say, a military activity, right? The Vikings infested a bit all these coastlines. It is true that they wouldn't penetrate particularly in the German hinterland, right? But they were still creating problems to the periphery as far as, in fact, central government that definitely had difficulties to be such at this point, especially before the rise of the Ottonian dynasty was doing. So the wealth that could be derived from the market at Aithabu reinforced the Danish cause, causing also jealousy among the other Scandinavians. Aithabu would be destroyed by the Swedes later on, and showing also the temporary nature of these settlements. We talk about the largest settlement, yes, but these at some point did fall, right, evaporate. This is not just like previous settlements in, say, even in Central Europe that were founded at some point in the early Middle Ages and High Middle Ages and remained those great centers of power. This literally rose and fell because of the traffics of the trade volume moved by the Vikings. When that ended, these centers ended as well, right? And they weren't naturally enormous, if not by Nordic standards. As a consequence, by the way, a truly sort of separate, independent realm of Aithabu was established around the year 900 by a Viking chieftain, Olaf from Svealand, that already highlights of course, the Swedish interest in the area. Svealand was also one, as you know. There was Uppsala. There were, in this sense, great interests for connecting this to major centers, like of the Norse world in the first place. And of course, the Danish monarchy was yet to consolidate in a way that would prevent such centers to become the seat of autonomous rulers and leaders. Olaf's son and successor Gnupa was killed, however, in battle against the Danish king, and as a consequence, this Aithabu realm vanished together with him, and that was, again, normal for the political fluidity of the times. The Danish southern border, along all this time, was floating as well. For example, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II at some point occupied the region between the river Ida and the inlet Schlei. We're talking the years 974, 83, right? And this area was established with the obvious strategic purpose of denying the crossing of resources up to Aithabu that were deep at the bottom of the inlet Schlei, so that even if the Germans didn't quite have much of a strong, say, counterpart as a stronghold, as a center from the other side, they could still inhibit say, navigation there. This Ottonian move was also rendered more serious by the fact that the newly conquered land was established as the Mark of Schleswig, right? So not just becoming de facto part of the Holy Roman Empire from a political and administrative point of view, but also stimulating German colonization that already at that point was starting to overflow also towards the north. Right here, continental Europe is regaining steam at an unprecedented pace, and that's where Germany, in fact, becomes the strongest side, and especially with Saxony again, that is managing this in this very second half of the 10th century from such a close distance. And that over time would bring, in fact, this lands also to change, and linguistically, ethnically, and to cause, say, further attrition, of course, between the Germans and the Danes, as they were de facto gradually differentiating themselves at that point. As we were saying before, Haithabu was burned by the Swedes a first time. Actually, this happened under the reign of Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, ruling between 986 and 1014. The situation was actually stabilized, but attacks on Haithabu were reiterated, so much so that this settlement was finally destroyed by fire for good in 1066. And this was a big deal because, again, it's the end of an era, right? At this point, Denmark has actually established itself as a proper monarchy, of course, as a Christian one for quite a while, and of course, the entire structure of the system didn't depend mainly on just, again, a collection of say, nobiliar power that didn't even recognize an overlordship. So, in order to prevent southern invaders to swarm through the Jutland, right? So, the core of Danish power is further reinforced north, and this area does remain important, definitely, but it also was spared in part by at least this projects of simple attempt at further annexation by the deterrence constituted by the new Scandinavian monarchy. Adam of Bremen reports 10 years later the destruction of Haithabu, that the Ida River was the border between Denmark and the Saxon, thus the German territories. So again, we've been talking about Danish, Germans, but what does this really mean in practice? Especially when is the time in which, a part was essentially conceived as being Danish and one German? Well, say national identities are something that have very deep roots without considering them as absolute, sclerotic, categorical, or nationalistic, which has a completely different meaning than that. It's obvious that when the Danes and the Saxons met one another in this area, and they were the major powers, you can argue that it was already this this dichotomy. We've seen the word the Frisians even in the western part of the land, the Slavs, right? So it was a composite situation, but the political frame, at least relatively simplified, with the consolidation of the Duchy of Saxony, the Kingdom of Denmark, and generally speaking, the boundary with the Holy Roman Empire. However, the picture is more nuanced, right? This topic actually would require a video on its own, but reflect on what we just said. Essentially, the Danes came to colonize Schleswig from what is essentially today's eastern part of Denmark. The Germans did so coming from essentially the Holstein, while the county north of the Elbe River had been, again, essentially a battleground between the two groups, as well as we've seen certain Slavic people as well. So, at least if one goes back in time, obviously it goes without saying that the Danish scholars tended at least to point to the existence of their sort of national place names north of the Ida and the Danevirke as sort of evidence that at least most of Schleswig had been at one point Danish, right, as we've seen from essentially the migration era onwards. The Germans instead tend to do something else, that is to, first of all, stress the fact that this area was overall and essentially Germanic, meaning that, of course, the same process by which we think of Germany, even in mature times, of its medieval say, national monarchy were essentially nationally composite, right? So they were Germanic indeed, but there is all the question of whether, I don't know, what at that time a Dutch, right, and an Austrian or say in fact say a Nordalbingen or a Swabian would think really to be more or less German. And what did that mean? Because before the 9th century, and mostly stemming from monastic authors, like the entire concept of a German country didn't quite exist, right? It started, of course, from the Carolingian repartition of these two macro areas, but even in that way, say the eastern part was put together just for politically administrative purposes, and it just evolved, surely on the basis, in fact, of a Germanic identity, into at least a narrower German one in the land over a very long time, in a longer way than other, say, national realities in Europe. This is particularly fascinating because it's obvious that by stressing that there was a broader Germanic say identity, the same Germans could extend even the extent of their influence, right? As it happened again through Germans that managed to at some point even to hijack the Scandinavian monarchies, etc. And thus to blur the differences between these various Germanic boundaries, let's put it in this way. Obviously this is a tendentious and partisan way of thinking, but I'm not attributing to the contemporary scholarship, but just how the rivalry between Denmark and Germany at some point historically about the 19th century had developed, right? So the wars between and considering this regard again that most of, say, the foundations of contemporarily accepted by scientific standard medieval historiography was starting at the time, and countries like Germany, also Denmark, were quite involved in that build-up. So the narrative there did matter a lot. There is, however, another aspect, that is the fact that we will see in another video about the second half of the Middle Ages, that Schleswig became an autonomous entity and a duchy in the 13th century. Since it had at that point truly been hegemonized by the Germans, because it had been again colonized, dominated from the south, and that is also self-evident. So the Duchy of Schleswig, or the aforementioned southern Jutland, would have been, similarly to Holstein, in fact independent of the Kingdom of Denmark, and also being a fief of the Holy Roman Empire, that in this sense was, of course, considering it as part of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, later the Kingdom of Germany, and because it had originated from this, as we've seen, marginal area of the previous Saxon settlements, and so being actually separated from the Duchy of Saxon, importantly enough, that is Nordalbinge, right? That it would be today's Western Holstein, and that had in fact been mostly occupied by Saxons, right? Interestingly enough, in the 13th century, the Dukes of Schleswig expanded to the present Holstein, actually clearing further a possible Danish overlordship, right? So Schleswig would be, to say the least, a pain in the behind for Denmark, right? The nobility in the Duchy of Holstein within the Holy Roman Empire definitely fought against Denmark, had all those kind of interferences with the crown, etc. There is a Danish position exemplified by an inscription on stone in the walls of the town of today, in fact, Schleswig-Holstein in Germany, Rendsburg, right? That is Rendsburg in Danish. That is Eidora Romani terminus imperi which in Latin stands that the river Ida is the border of the Roman Empire. Right? This is powerful, because as you understand here, there is something that goes even beyond the sense of nationality. There is an imperial authority called into the matter, right? Notice here there is no reference to the holiness of the term. It's just the Roman Empire, just like the Carolingian, especially the Ottonian, would have really thought themselves to be, and how the Holy Roman Empire effectively was, right? So there was a resistance even from some nobles of Holstein that had been pressured by Schleswig, or in fact into submission, etc., to challenge the status of affair. But that's where essentially the Germans still got the upper hand there. Needless to say, from a German perspective, those lands in the far north, all the various marks along the Elbe, further southeast, etc., were, and I made a video about Brandenburg that a bit more distant, but surely had issues with Mecklenburg, with Denmark, etc. Definitely were very autonomous, as you know, like especially after the end of a strong Saxon power in the 12th century. These are some of the most fragmented areas of Germany, or at least there is some of which in which there is a power vacuum. All the great German dynasties are from the south, and even when they install themselves, like the Hohenzollern later, exactly in that northeastern area, it's in fact substantially a different picture. But the Luxembourgs are in Bohemia, so not even in Germany. The Habsburgs are in Austria. The Wittelsbachs, they have scattered territories here and there, but effectively the north remains very autonomous. And we've seen in many other videos how there were many other so-called German lands within the Kingdom of Germany, including, I think about the County of Holland, for example. It had always tried somewhat to escape. Centralizing pressure was very Viking sort of hybrid, right? Even more actually than Schleswig-Holstein, and it eventually would be, well, today it's another country, right? Literally, because it seceded at some point from the Holy Roman Empire. So what I'm saying here is that there were some identities, like say the Saxon one or the one of the same Schleswig, that yes, were German, but it's not that they were really living in a reality in which they were looking, let's say, up to a German king, or there was a strong German national monarchy, which actually failed, as you know, in the 13th century, for good, right? So, yes, there is a linguistic, a cultural divide, but these areas are also very, very shaded and somewhat similar. I mean, to Thuringian, of course, somebody from Schleswig looked dramatically similar to somebody from Denmark, right? So even there, from a German perspective, there is not that sort of rigidity that eventually 19th century nationalism wanted to make about, for times in which those kind of identities were much more fluid and truly interested from a political point of view to remain so, right? Independent from their actual ethnic background that was either this or that, especially but in the full Middle Ages. So a final consideration regarding Danes, Saxons, and Angles, also from earlier times. As we've seen, southern Jutland was inhabited originally by these Germanic tribes, such as the Cimbri, the Angles, the Utes, right? You have North Germanic Danes, the West Germanic Frisians, right? And it would come to be mostly inhabited by Saxons, right? Aside from the Slavs, the Obotrites and other groups further from the east. By the way, consider that, of course, we talk these, especially tribal realities, as if they were one simply, but until they stabilized, I don't know, like Saxon, they were, even by the time they were taken out, they were hardly more about the common identity and rather the one of the single groups, right? So the Saxons were the last and bigger, more cohesive nation to submit to Charlemagne in 804, finally. And this is really the most important game changer in the history of Schleswig-Holstein, the contemporary one, in the early High Middle Ages. At that point, the Franks occupied Saxony with their counts. They established the boundaries of the empire in 810 as far as the Schlei in Schleswig, right? Because that had been already reached at some point by, even before Otto II, the century later. In 811, the river Ida was, however, declared as the most important border between the Carolingian Empire and the Danes. Then began the struggle between Denmark and the Holy Roman Empire. In 934, Henry the Fowler, right, the king of Germany, Henry I, established the Mark of Schleswig. He was really the first one to do so, right? At the time of his grandson Otto II, the mark that we said before had been was established. That point had essentially be reinforced as such, right? But the idea again that even from Carolingian times, actually, this territory had been heavily militarized as a purpose of, in fact, for the purpose of defense and attack, actually, of projection, because the Franks did think at least about invading Denmark at some point. And this had, as we've seen, brought also in the meanwhile to German colonization of the land. This would become an outpost of the empire against the Danes. Well, south of this there was contemporarily, and we've seen it in the video about the Ottonian campaigns, the clash between the empire and the Slavs. The Slavs had this process of, Christianization, of gradual stabilization. Some would be conquered, brought down before this would happen. Others would be fundamentally subsumed by the imperial administrative structures, right, as vassals. And you know that this extends, goes on. We made lots of videos about, Silesia and further east. So there are also a lot that we have to really discuss. And it was an incredibly slow process in this area. We've seen it somewhat for the Ascanians in the video about the Margraviate of Brandenburg, right? These areas had very few surplus, right? They hadn't practically east of the Alps any kind of, and before that, consider also Saxony was largely like this before the Carolingian conquest. Any form of urbanization, for example, or more, say, permanent infrastructure that could help founding, say, greater forms of power, hierarchy, right? So whichever area was controlled by the empire was advanced compared, say, to Denmark and the Slavic lands, but it also was extremely similar to it, right? As if the Saxons were very close to the Danes, well, the same Franks originally and the ones living in Austrasia and so on were very similar to the Saxons. So there were, again, these areas were as good as they could be, resourceful as it could be for the locals, of course. Still very undeveloped. They were cold, which is something that for the economy of the time, based on crops, it is definitely something you may want to consider. And it's not even the Viking era that manages to fully change this, right? And especially to make it arrive to a level of continental development that would osmotically, emanatistically keep informing the North for quite a long time. before, for example, some proper feudal monarchies would be stabilized. So the clash against the Slavs, as we've seen, had been a thing for the Danes themselves. They had at some point attacked the Obodrites. The Viking era saw an important infestation of Central and Eastern Europe from the side of the effectively Scandinavians that had the upper hand, right? The lands of the Slavs were less developed than the ones of Scandinavia, right? This is important to stress. Not enormously, right? Depending on which, right? At least the Kievan Rus at some point in the south had definitely an impressive power. But if we're talking about the Baltic broadly meant, of course, Scandinavia, in spite of all, was more developed than those places. We've seen it in the video about medieval Finland. Essentially, those were, say, the Germans' effect of the situation, colonizing, having the bigger gun, the fleets, some sort of proto-feudal system, definitely more robust at home than it was in those other lands. Were really also pretty tough in terms of terrain. They were swampy, heavily forested, etc. The important was controlling the, as we've seen also for what the Ottonians do with Etebub, the river mouth, right? The estuaries, the inlets, so that whatever came from the interland through the more primitive routes could be controlled from the sea if you had an adequate naval power. And many Slavs would join, as we were saying, also into piracy. They would join the Vikings or fighting with them, competing with them. There were the Pomeranians, for example. They were also quite, even after the end of the so-called Viking era, continued to be active, right? The Scandinavians kept doing essentially what they were doing. The only difference is that they moved from the North Sea to the Baltic, because Western Europe was essentially, at that point, not so permeable as it had been before. And the Slavs instead were still to be tamed. Still, there were pagan tribes to crush, right? Still pretty late in time. If you look at the video about medieval Lithuania, and made multiple ones about, you know what we're talking about just by common culture. There was a pagan Slavic revolt in 983 after the death of Emperor Otto II in Italy. That caused this enormous dynastic issue, mostly because the wife, as you know, was Byzantine, and thus she could not rule. She was not particularly liked. The young Otto III was a minor. There was all the issue of keeping this entire system together, Germany, Italy, and so on, and the Slavs at the fringe began to make a bit of a mess. But so there was as important consequence that the Slavic parts of Schleswig-Holstein, today's territory, reverted to paganism and independence for a while. Right, it was very short-lived. There was nothing that could have a future in perspective, but it was still, again, reflecting in this corner of Europe how precarious local government really was, right? Because, again, surplus was very limited. There weren't much pre-existing structures. There were these primitive, hostile populations that, yes, you could crush in open field, because generally speaking, the Western heavily armored cavalry was becoming, ever more punching and effective, and it was the expression again of a greater civilization. But on the longer run, if especially the local rulers were not so interested in getting over with these people for good, they would say, okay, well, they will hold, right? At least we have more important things to do, and we will not concentrate specifically on them, right? Eventually, those areas were re-established, were Christianized, right? So it wasn't a long-term change, but it still created problems. The Saxon dukes continued to rule central Holstein when the noblemen Lothar of Supplenburg, eventually Holy Roman Emperor from 1133, became Duke of Saxony in 1106, because the Billung line, the mark of which had been an important power in the area, as you know, extinguished. He enfeoffed as a new ruler the Lord Adolphus of Schauenburg with the County of Holstein. This would reinforce further the Saxon lordship on the land, right? Adolf became Adolphus I, Count of Holstein, right, with the Saxon and later Lower Saxon dukes, by the way, as his, the liege lords of the dynasty. Now, liege vassal is an important one, that essentially, owing feudal allegiance and service to a lord, they also owed fealty above any other lord. This is crucial because it highlights what we were telling before regarding the local identities. A liege lord is a big deal. Normally, you are liege to a king, an emperor. Actually, Lothar of Supplenburg would become both of them, the king of Germany in that case. But the point in that remaining, de facto, a Saxon dependency of some sort from a feudal point of view. And this shows how it was rather the local, regional, feudal powers that were more important in the definition of the various local identities than the broader national sense of whoever these guys were. Let's leave aside the fact that the Saxons, again, thought of themselves as the Saxons, not as the Germans, right? This is particularly true, especially in this northern world, that knew less the sense of Frankish grandeur, right? Even if Saxony had been an imperial house and had been connected exactly with Franconia, that I made a video on, as in fact the most prestigiously symbolic, but also particularly advanced and somehow more polished and refined of the German lands, because of not just being having been significantly colonized by the Franks since the beginning, Merovingian, Carolingian times, would feel less, in fact, the sense of monarchy, of state, of royalty, right? Southern Germany was the most sensitive to that, was the most developed area, was the richest one. This one, as a consequence, started feeling like it's not just that we are the northern Germans, we're properly Saxons or whatever. This is also true for, even the southern Germans, right? But in this area, even more. So Schleswig and Holstein would, for this reason, become ever more something on their own, still today, right, as a state on their own, and with a Saxon, by the way, that is parceled even in smaller chunks, mostly for dynastic reasons. But you have, for example, Hamburg, that is literally a city-state, still on its own in the German Federation. So you understand how, let's say, primitively unspoiled from actually the broader sense of nationalistic understanding these lands actually were. And that is something which, of course, always overlaps with a sense that from one side there are the Germans, from one side there are the Danish. But when you have places that are really a bit really that similar, you read again all these sort of, there are double names in general for looking at the tradition of different areas, the fact that these same states feel, in fact, something like still separated, and you have still settlements that, if you go further east, take the name still in the Germanized version of a Slavic term, etc. You realize how how much history there is behind that, right? And how you can't quite simply flatten everything that easily. But we will see it also better in the other videos about the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, 15th centuries that really are say animated by a substantial degree also of warfare, by the way, that definitely involves Holstein, Denmark, and to a broader extent of literally, having German nobility from these duchies, not even from, say, a royal expedition, taking on properly the Scandinavian kingdoms and even managing to control them to some extent. This is brutal, right? And we've seen it in part in the videos about, again, the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.